The Frozen North Mysteries, The Midnight Beacon, by Brian Hamilton. When the dormant Eldred Rock Lighthouse mysteriously reactivates, Maggie and Cal uncover buried secrets of greed and betrayal. Facing harsh wilderness and lurking dangers, they race to unravel its dark, haunting legacy. Prelude to The Midnight Beacon. In the heart of Alaska's Lynn Canal, the Eldred Rock Lighthouse loomed like a sentinel over the icy waters, its weathered facade a silent witness to the passage of time. The storms of winter battered its cliffs, the crashing waves a symphony of nature's indifference. For decades, the lighthouse stood dark, its beacon extinguished, a relic of a past steeped in tragedy and whispered legends. But on a stormy night, the long-dormant light awakened, cutting through the mist with an eerie precision. Fishermen returned to the village with wild tales of the beacon's resurrection, sparking fear and fascination in equal measure. Eldred Rock was cursed, the locals said, a place where shadows moved on their own and secrets were swallowed by the sea. For Maggie Lomak, a journalist drawn to untold stories, the lighthouse held more than just mystery. It was tied to her own history, her great-uncle one of many who vanished under its watchful eye. For Alaska State Trooper Cal Renner, the beacon was a call to duty, a puzzle that couldn't be ignored despite his skepticism of the supernatural. As they journeyed to Eldred Rock, Maggie and Cal uncovered more than they bargained for: cryptic carvings, long-forgotten smuggling routes, and a conspiracy buried beneath the lighthouse's foundations. The light wasn't just a warning, it was a trap, luring the curious into a web of greed and betrayal. In a place where the wilderness itself seemed to conspire against them, Maggie and Cal would learn that the darkness held more than ghosts. And as the storm raged on, the midnight beacon illuminated not just the path ahead, but the dangers hidden within. The Frozen North Mysteries series follows Alaska State Trooper Cal Renner as he unravels chilling secrets, facing greed, betrayal, and danger in Alaska's untamed wilderness. The Midnight Beacon. Setting the scene, winter had a way of taking over Lynn Canal with unrelenting force. The jagged coastline bristled with icy cliffs that jutted defiantly into the frigid waters. Winds howled like unseen predators, slicing through the fjord and sending waves crashing against the rocky outcroppings. Snow covered everything in a heavy, silent blanket, muffling even the occasional cries of seabirds circling overhead. In this unforgiving expanse of Alaskan wilderness, Eldred Rock Lighthouse loomed as a weathered sentinel. Once a beacon of hope for sailors navigating the perilous waters, the lighthouse now stood as a relic of a forgotten past. Its tower, streaked with rust and crusted with salt, seemed to bow under the weight of decades of storms and neglect. Scaffolding clung to its base, the ongoing restoration project a Sisyphean effort hampered by the site's isolation and the unpredictability of the weather. Even abandoned, Eldred Rock held a presence, ominous, unyielding, as if it were watching. Locals spoke of the lighthouse in hushed tones, weaving tales that blurred the line between fact and superstition. Some claimed it was cursed, a place where shipwrecks and disappearances left echoes of tragedy. Others whispered about its history as a smuggling hub, its light once used to guide illicit operations under the cover of night. Whatever the truth, Eldred Rock had earned its reputation as a place better left alone. The mystery unfolds. One stormy night, as the winds screamed through the fjord, the darkness was suddenly pierced by a beam of light. Fishermen returning from a late haul stopped in their tracks, their boats rocking violently as they stared in disbelief at the lighthouse. Its beacon, long dormant, cut through the mist with a rhythmic precision that felt both unnatural and deliberate. By the time the fishermen reached the docks, the town was buzzing with the news. The lighthouse hadn't been operational in decades, its light extinguished shortly after the mysterious disappearance of its last keeper in the 1970s. Theories spread like wildfire. "It's a warning," Jacob Tanner muttered to a group gathered at the cafe the next morning. The old man leaned heavily on his cane, his weathered face etched with concern. "The ghost of the last keeper. He's telling us to stay away." Marianne Blake, a widow with little patience for ghost stories, rolled her eyes. "Don't start with your curses, Jacob. Someone probably got curious and found a way to turn it back on. Or someone's using it," another villager chimed in. "Smugglers, maybe. The canal's perfect for hiding things, and that lighthouse would make a great signal." Jacob wasn't swayed. "It's more than that. There are things out there in the mist, things that don't want to be found." In the corner of the cafe, Maggie Lomak sipped her coffee, her notebook open on the table in front of her. She had been visiting Fort Yukon for a freelance piece on the local wildlife, but the talk of the lighthouse had quickly caught her attention. Eldred Rock wasn't just another Alaskan landmark to her. Her great-uncle had worked on its restoration back in the 1970s, one of the many craftsmen brought in to stabilize the structure after years of neglect. He'd vanished shortly after the keeper's disappearance, leaving behind little more than a cryptic journal filled with sketches of the lighthouse and fragments of his thoughts. "What do you think, Maggie?" Marianne asked, noticing her quiet interest. Maggie set her mug down, a faint smile playing on her lips. "I think it's worth looking into. If someone's messing with that light, they've got a reason. And I'd like to know what it is." Jacob leaned forward, his cane tapping against the wooden floor. "You go up there, and you'll regret it," he warned. "That place doesn't forgive. Just ask the last man who thought he could tame it." "I don't believe in ghosts, Mr. Tanner," Maggie said, though her tone was gentle. "But I do believe in answers." Later that day, Maggie found herself standing outside the sheriff's office, waiting for Cal Renner. The Alaska State Trooper had a reputation for being methodical and unflinching, a man who approached even the strangest cases with a level head. Maggie had worked with him before and knew he was skeptical of anything that veered too close to folklore. "So," Cal said as he stepped outside, his jacket zipped tight against the cold. "I hear you're chasing ghost stories again." "It's not a ghost story," Maggie replied. "The light's back on, and people are seeing figures near the coast. There's something going on, and I think it's connected to the lighthouse's past." Cal raised an eyebrow. "Connected how?" Maggie hesitated before answering. "My great-uncle disappeared there. And I think whatever happened to him is part of the same story." Cal sighed, pulling on his gloves. "All right. Let's take a look. But if this turns out to be nothing, I'll buy you coffee for a week," Maggie interrupted, her determination evident. As the two prepared to charter a boat to Eldred Rock, the lighthouse stood silent and foreboding in the distance, its lights slicing through the mist like a beckoning call. Whatever waited for them on that isolated islet, one thing was certain, the answers wouldn't come easily. Journey to Eldred Rock. The fishing boat rocked violently as it battled the relentless waves of Lynn Canal. The icy wind howled around them, whipping through the fjord with an unyielding ferocity that froze the spray before it hit their faces. Maggie gripped the railing tightly, her knuckles white, while Cal stood stoically at the bow, his eyes fixed on the silhouette of Eldred Rock in the distance. "Storm's building," the captain, a grizzled man named Elias, shouted over the engine's growl. "You've got an hour, 2 at best. After that, I'm heading back, with or without you." "Understood," Cal replied, his voice calm but firm. He turned to Maggie. "You sure about this?" She nodded, though the knot in her stomach tightened as the lighthouse grew larger. "I have to be." As they neared the rocky islet, the full isolation of Eldred Rock came into focus. The lighthouse stood defiant against the encroaching storm, its rust-streaked walls a testament to decades of neglect. The scaffolding that clung to its base swayed precariously in the wind, a stark reminder of the unfinished restoration project. The beacon, now dark, loomed ominously overhead, its lens fractured like a broken eye. Elias cut the engine and threw them a line. "Good luck," he muttered. "You'll need it." Cal hopped onto the rocks with practiced ease, offering a hand to Maggie as she struggled to find her footing on the slick, uneven surface. The cold bit into their skin as they began to climb up the narrow path toward the lighthouse, the sound of crashing waves echoing behind them. Exploring the exterior. Up close, the lighthouse was even more haunting. The paint had peeled away entirely in some places, revealing the corroded metal beneath. Moss clung to its foundation, and the scaffolding creaked with every gust of wind. Maggie shivered, not just from the cold but from the palpable sense of abandonment that clung to the place. "Over here," she called, pointing to a set of faint footprints in the snow leading away from the lighthouse. The prints disappeared into the rocks near the edge of the islet. Cal crouched to examine them, his brow furrowing. "Recent," he said. "Someone's been here." Following the trail, they discovered a hidden cove partially obscured by a tangle of driftwood and seaweed. The tide had washed away any clear signs of activity, but among the debris, Cal spotted a rusted lantern and a signaling flag. He held them up for Maggie to see. "This isn't random," he said. "These were used to guide someone in or out." Maggie's gaze drifted to the cliffs below, where waves crashed violently against the rocks. "Smugglers," she suggested. "Could be," Cal replied, his tone cautious. "Or someone trying to make it look that way." Inside the lighthouse, the heavy door to the lighthouse groaned as Cal forced it open, the hinges protesting after years of neglect. A musty, damp smell wafted out, carrying the scent of decay and salt. Their flashlights cut through the darkness, illuminating a scene frozen in time. The entryway was cluttered with rusted tools and scattered debris. A single chair sat in the corner, its legs warped and splintered. The walls were lined with faded photographs of past keepers, their faces stern and weathered. A thick layer of dust covered everything, disturbed only by a faint trail of footprints leading deeper into the structure. "This place feels like a tomb," Maggie said, her voice low. "It might as well be," Cal replied. "Let's keep moving." They climbed the spiral staircase, their footsteps echoing in the hollow tower. On the second floor, they found what appeared to be the keeper's office. A desk sat in the center, piled with yellowed papers and a rusted oil lamp. Maggie sifted through the mess, pulling out a logbook with brittle pages. "Listen to this," she said, reading aloud. "Shadows in the night. They move when I'm not looking. The light, it's not mine anymore." She looked up at Cal, her face pale. "What do you think he meant?" "Hard to say," Cal replied. "But it sounds like he wasn't alone here. Or at least, he didn't think he was." An ominous discovery. Their search led them to the basement, a damp and claustrophobic space lit only by the faint glow of their flashlights. The walls were lined with corroded shelves, and the floor was slick with condensation. Maggie noticed a section of the floorboards that looked newer than the rest, as if they had been replaced recently. "Help me with this," she said, motioning to Cal. Together, they pried the boards loose, revealing a hidden compartment beneath. Inside, they found a collection of maps and ledgers, each meticulously labeled. Maggie spread one of the maps across the floor, her flashlight illuminating a network of marked routes. The map was old, its edges frayed, but the markings were clear, shipping routes labeled as safe zones, all centering around Eldred Rock. "This was a smuggling hub," Maggie said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They used the lighthouse to guide their ships." Cal examined one of the ledgers, his brow furrowing. "These dates go back decades. Whoever was running this operation knew what they were doing." Maggie's attention was drawn to a note scrawled in the corner of the map. "Look at this." The note read, "Keep the light alive, or it will come for you." A chill ran down her spine as she stared at the words. "What do you think it means?" "I think," Cal said, standing and scanning the room, "we're not the only ones interested in this place. And whoever else is out there doesn't want us to find anything." As they replaced the floorboards and prepared to leave, a distant noise echoed through the tunnels, a faint, metallic scraping sound that sent a shiver through both of them. Maggie glanced at Cal, her grip tightening on the flashlight. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. "Yeah," Cal said, his hand instinctively moving toward his sidearm. "Let's go." With the weight of their discovery pressing down on them, they ascended back to the surface, where the storm was beginning to build once more. The lighthouse stood silent behind them, its darkened beacon a stark reminder of the mysteries yet to be unraveled. A warning from the past. Back at their temporary base in the old keeper's quarters, Maggie sat cross-legged on the floor, the vanished keeper's logbook spread out before her. The fragile pages crackled under her careful fingers as she pieced together the man's cryptic notes. "Listen to this," she said, her voice tinged with unease. "I see them at night, shadows in the mist. They don't belong here, yet they move as if they own the rock." She glanced up at Cal, who leaned against the desk, his arms crossed. "Figures on the cliffs," Cal murmured. "Sounds like he wasn't alone." "It gets worse," Maggie continued, flipping to the final entry. "The beacon is not ours. It belongs to them." "Them," Cal repeated, his voice flat. "Who's he talking about? Smugglers? Or something else?" Maggie shrugged, though the tension in her shoulders betrayed her nerves. Whoever, or whatever, it was, it scared him enough to leave behind this. She held up the logbook, its cover worn from years of neglect. He thought the light was more than just a tool. He thought it was a warning. Cal straightened, his expression dark. A warning, or a signal. Spotting the smugglers. That evening, they hiked to a ridge overlooking Eldred Rock. The wind whipped through the fjord, carrying the tang of salt and the promise of another storm. Maggie adjusted her binoculars, scanning the dark waters beyond the lighthouse. There, she whispered, pointing toward a faint glimmer on the horizon. A small boat bobbed in the waves, its silhouette barely discernible in the fading light. Cal squinted, pulling out his own binoculars. "Got it," he said. He focused on the figures moving on the deck, their handheld light flashing in a rhythmic sequence toward the cliffs below the lighthouse. Maggie frowned. "It's a signal. Someone's out there." Cal scanned the shoreline until he spotted movement near the base of the cliffs. Two figures, bundled against the cold, moved with purpose, their gestures precise and practiced. "They're not just hanging around for fun," he muttered. "They're working." "They're using the lighthouse," Maggie said, lowering her binoculars. "It's the perfect cover. Remote, inaccessible, and creepy enough to keep people away. And the light, they're reactivating it to guide their boat." "Smuggling," Cal concluded. "Transporting stolen goods, maybe drugs. And they're counting on no one daring to come close." Maggie's mind raced. "But why now? The lighthouse has been abandoned for decades. What's changed?" "Could be an old operation starting back up," Cal speculated. "Or someone new who found out about the site's history. Either way, they're getting bold. And if they think we're onto them..." He didn't finish the thought, but Maggie understood. The stakes were rising. A close encounter. Determined to investigate further, Cal and Maggie descended toward the cliffs, their footsteps muffled by the snow. The terrain grew more treacherous as they approached the area where they had seen the figures earlier. Maggie's breath came in quick, frosty bursts as she followed Cal, her flashlight casting long, eerie shadows across the jagged rocks. "Stay close," Cal whispered, his voice low and tense. His hand hovered near his sidearm, every nerve on edge. They hadn't gone far when a sharp noise stopped them in their tracks, a muffled thud, followed by the crunch of footsteps on frozen ground. Before they could react, two figures emerged from the darkness, their faces obscured by scars. One held a flashlight, the other a rifle. "Drop it," the armed man barked, leveling the weapon at Cal, "now." Cal raised his hands slowly, his expression calm despite the tension crackling in the air. Maggie froze, her mind racing as she calculated their options. "We're not here to cause trouble," Cal said evenly. "We're just passing through." The man with the rifle sneered. "No one passes through Eldred Rock." "What do you know about the light?" "Enough to know you're not supposed to be here either," Cal replied, his tone sharp. The second man stepped forward, his grip tightening on the flashlight. "Let's just get rid of them," he muttered. Before the situation could escalate further, Cal lunged, grabbing the barrel of the rifle and forcing it upward as a shot rang out into the night. Maggie ducked instinctively, her heart pounding as she scrambled for cover behind a boulder. The struggle was brutal and quick. Cal used his training to disarm the man, sending the rifle clattering to the ground. The second attacker rushed forward, but Maggie acted swiftly, grabbing a loose rock and hurling it at him. The man stumbled, giving Cal enough time to knock him off balance. "Move!" Cal shouted, grabbing Maggie's arm as she hesitated. They sprinted toward the cliffs, the attackers hot on their heels. Maggie's familiarity with the terrain gave them a crucial advantage. She led Cal through a narrow crevice that twisted upward, its slick walls providing just enough cover. The sounds of pursuit grew fainter as they climbed, their breaths ragged in the freezing air. Finally, they reached a small plateau, the ridge offering a temporary reprieve. Cal leaned against a boulder, catching his breath, while Maggie scanned the darkness below for signs of their pursuers. "I think we lost them," she whispered, though her voice trembled. "For now," Cal said grimly. "But they'll be back. And next time, they won't hesitate." Maggie nodded, her resolve hardening. "Then we need to figure out what they're after, and fast." The lighthouse loomed in the distance, its darkened beacon a silent reminder of the dangers they face. As the wind picked up and the first flakes of snow began to fall, Maggie and Cal knew they were racing against more than just time. The hidden caves. The wind howled through the jagged cliffs as Cal and Maggie carefully descended to the base of Eldred Rock. The trail they'd picked up earlier led to a narrow, almost hidden entrance carved into the rocky outcrop beneath the lighthouse. Cal shone his flashlight into the gaping darkness of the cave, the beam catching the glint of frost-coated walls and the faint shimmer of crates stacked deep inside. "This must be it," Cal muttered, stepping cautiously into the opening. The air inside was damp and heavy, carrying the faint scent of salt and mildew. The caves twisted and turned like a labyrinth, their ceilings low and uneven. The sound of dripping water echoed around them, heightening the eerie atmosphere. Maggie followed closely behind, her boots crunching on the rocky floor. "What is this place?" Maggie asked, her voice hushed. Cal ran his flashlight over the contents of the nearest crate. It was filled with antique vases wrapped in faded burlap, each piece stamped with inventory codes. Nearby, another crate contained what looked like outdated radio equipment, its metal casing corroded but still intact. "Stolen artifacts," Cal said grimly. "And this," he gestured to the equipment. "Looks like it could have been used to communicate with ships offshore." Maggie's flashlight caught the edge of a dusty, weathered lantern resting atop one of the crates. She picked it up carefully, brushing away layers of grime to reveal faintly etched initials. "HR, this belonged to the keeper," she whispered, her heart racing. "Henry Rowe. He must have been involved in this operation." Cal frowned. "Or he found out about it and got caught up in something he couldn't escape." The deeper they went, the more crates they uncovered, each filled with an eclectic array of goods, smuggled weapons, vintage jewelry, and even ledgers documenting transactions. The scale of the operation was staggering. Uncovering the scheme. Maggie's hands trembled as she pried open a particularly large crate marked with Icebound Resources corporate insignia. Inside, she found stacks of documents sealed in protective sleeves. She held up one of the papers, scanning its contents by flashlight. "This isn't just a smuggling operation," she said, her voice tight. "These documents link Icebound Resources to illegal shipments along the entire Alaskan coast. They've been using sites like this lighthouse as hubs for decades." Cal looked over her shoulder, his jaw tightening. So the restoration project was just a cover to access the caves and restart the operation. Maggie flipped through more of the documents, piecing together the broader picture. The ledger showed shipments of rare artifacts and minerals, some extracted from indigenous land, others stolen outright. Icebound Resources had used the lighthouse's cursed reputation to keep locals at bay, ensuring the secrecy of their operations. "This explains why Henry Rowe disappeared," Maggie said. "If he threatened to expose them, they would have seen him as a liability." Cal nodded, his expression dark. "And now they're trying to tie up loose ends again." Maggie held up another document, her fingers brushing against its frayed edges. It was a map, detailing shipping routes marked as safe zones, all converging on Eldred Rock. She swallowed hard, realizing just how many lives had been impacted by this web of greed and exploitation. "We need to get this evidence out of here," she said firmly. The smuggler's trap. Their urgency was interrupted by the sound of voices echoing through the caves. Maggie froze, her flashlight snapping off instinctively as she glanced at Cal. He motioned for her to stay low, drawing his sidearm as they listened. "They've been down here," one of the smugglers growled, his voice bouncing off the cave walls. "Footprints near the crates. Someone snooping where they shouldn't be." Another voice, colder and more controlled, replied, "Find them. And make sure they don't leave." Maggie's pulse quickened as the beam of a flashlight cut through the darkness, growing brighter with each step. She and Cal ducked behind a stack of crates, their breaths shallow. The smugglers were armed, their footsteps crunching ominously as they searched the tunnels. Cal leaned toward Maggie, his voice barely audible. "We need to move, now." They crept along the edges of the cave, keeping to the shadows as the smugglers' lights swept dangerously close. The tunnels twisted and turned, offering momentary cover, but it wasn't enough. A clatter of falling debris gave away their position, and a shout rang out. "Over there!" The smugglers charged, their footsteps pounding against the cave floor. Cal turned, his flashlight snapping on as he aimed his sidearm. "Stop!" he barked. The lead smuggler hesitated, but his accomplice raised a weapon. Before Cal could fire, Maggie grabbed a loose plank from the ground and swung it, knocking the gun from the man's hands. The smuggler cursed, lunging at her, but Cal stepped in, his fist connecting with the attacker's jaw. The scuffle echoed through the tunnels, the confined space amplifying every sound. Cal grabbed Maggie's arm, pulling her toward a narrow passage. "This way," he shouted. The smugglers followed, their shouts growing louder. Cal's flashlight illuminated a precarious section of the cave's ceiling ahead, loose rocks and timbers that looked ready to collapse. An idea flashed through his mind. "Keep going," he ordered Maggie, who hesitated before sprinting ahead. Cal aimed his flashlight upward, firing a single shot at the timbers. The structure groaned, and with a deafening crash, the ceiling gave way, sending a cascade of rocks and debris between them and the smugglers. The dust cloud was suffocating, but it bought them the time they needed. Escape and reflection. They emerged from the caves, gasping for air as the cold wind hit their faces. The storm had intensified, the waves crashing violently against the shore. Maggie clutched the documents tightly, her heart still racing. "Are you okay?" Cal asked, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. Maggie nodded, though her legs felt like jelly. "We have what we need," she said, holding up the evidence. "But they won't stop. Not until they've buried this for good." Cal scanned the horizon, his jaw set. "Then we make sure they can't." As they climbed back toward the lighthouse, the storm raged on, its fury a stark reminder of the danger that still loomed. The caves had revealed the truth, but the fight to bring it to light was far from over. The beacon's final signal. The storm howled through the darkness, its fury battering Eldred Rock with relentless force. The lighthouse loomed above, its fractured lens faintly illuminated by the occasional flash of lightning. Inside, Cal and Maggie crouched behind an overturned table in the entryway, their breaths visible in the freezing air. "They're heading to the top," Maggie whispered, clutching the stack of documents they'd recovered from the caves. "They're signaling reinforcements," Cal muttered, his jaw tightening. "If they bring in another ship, we're outnumbered." Above them, footsteps echoed through the spiraling staircase, accompanied by the metallic clang of equipment being hauled upward. The smugglers were moving quickly, their determination evident in their clipped voices. Cal glanced at Maggie. "We have to stop them." "How do we even get up there?" she asked, her voice laced with doubt. "This place is falling apart." Cal's gaze swept over the room, landing on the staircase that wound up the tower. Sections of the metal frame were bent, and debris from the storm littered the steps. The lighthouse groaned under the weight of the gale, its structure threatening to give way. "We don't have a choice," Cal said firmly. "Stay close and follow my lead." With a deep breath, they began their ascent. The climb was treacherous. Each step echoed ominously, the fragile stairs shuddering under their weight. Maggie gripped the railing tightly, her knuckles white as she tried to keep her footing on the slippery metal. The higher they went, the colder it became, the wind seeping through cracks in the lighthouse walls. Halfway up, a loud crack reverberated through the tower as a section of the staircase gave way beneath them. Maggie yelped, catching herself just in time. Cal turned back, grabbing her arm and pulling her to safety. "You all right?" he asked. "Still in one piece," she said, her voice shaking. "Let's keep moving." As they neared the top, the beam of a flashlight swept across the staircase below. One of the smugglers had spotted them. "They're coming up," the man shouted, his voice carrying over the storm. Cal drew his sidearm. "Go ahead, Maggie. I'll hold them off." "No," she said, her eyes blazing with determination. "We stopped that beacon together." They quickened their pace, the groaning of the structure growing louder with each step. The lantern room was just ahead, its faint glow visible through the cracked glass. The climax. Bursting into the lantern room, Cal and Maggie found themselves face to face with three smugglers. The leader stood by the beacon, adjusting its mechanisms to send a precise signal out into the storm. The other two men turned toward the intruders, weapons drawn. "You're too late," the leader sneered, his voice calm despite the chaos around him. "The ship's on its way." Cal raised his weapon. "Step away from the beacon." The leader laughed, unfazed. You think you can stop this? You're just one man. The room erupted into chaos. One of the smugglers lunged at Cal, knocking his weapon to the ground. They grappled, the confined space amplifying the sounds of the struggle. Maggie darted toward the beacon, her heart pounding as she studied its controls. The mechanisms were old and unfamiliar, but she knew one thing: if the beacon stayed lit, they were finished. Cal, buy me time, she shouted, her fingers fumbling with the knobs and switches. Cal barely heard her over the sounds of fists connecting with flesh. He threw his attacker against the wall, but another man came at him with a crowbar, forcing him to duck and retaliate with a swift punch. Maggie's hands shook as she found the power source. With a surge of adrenaline, she ripped out a critical wire. The beacon sputtered and died, its light extinguished. No, the leader roared, turning toward her. He lunged, but Maggie grabbed a nearby wrench and swung it with all her strength, knocking him backward. The storm chose that moment to make its presence known. A deafening crack of thunder shook the lighthouse, followed by a groan that sent shivers down Maggie's spine. The lantern room's already fragile structure began to give way, chunks of the floor crumbling into the sea below. Maggie, we have to go, Cal shouted, his voice urgent. The leader staggered to his feet, his eyes wild with desperation. You can't leave me here. Cal grabbed Maggie's arm, pulling her toward the exit as the floor collapsed behind them. They stumbled onto the staircase just as the lantern room caved in completely, its shattered glass and rusted beams swallowed by the raging waves. Escape and resolution. The lighthouse shuddered violently, its foundation buckling under the storm's assault. Cal and Maggie raced down the stairs, dodging falling debris as the tower threatened to come apart around them. The smugglers' shouts faded into the background, drowned out by the roar of the sea. They burst out into the open air, the icy winds slamming into them like a physical force. Behind them, the lighthouse leaned precariously, its once proud silhouette now a crumbling shadow of itself. Elias's fishing boat bobbed in the distance, the captain waving frantically for them to hurry. Cal and Maggie sprinted across the rocky islet, their lungs burning with effort. They leapt into the boat just as a final, deafening crash signaled the lighthouse's collapse. Hold on! Elias shouted, gunning the engine as waves surged around them. Maggie collapsed onto the deck, clutching the stack of documents she had managed to save. Cal sat beside her, his chest heaving as he watched Eldred Rock fade into the stormy horizon. We did it, Maggie said, her voice barely audible over the wind. Cal nodded, his expression grim. But this isn't over. Not by a long shot. Justice and unanswered questions. By the time the storm subsided, the wreckage of Eldred Rock Lighthouse had become a symbol of both triumph and tragedy. The Coast Guard arrived the following morning, their ships cutting through the misty waters to secure the islet. The surviving smugglers were rounded up, their confessions tying icebound resources to a sprawling network of illicit activities. Maggie handed over the documents she'd risked her life to recover, the evidence detailing decades of smuggling operations and their resurgence under Icebound's leadership. The company's name had long been whispered in connection with corruption, but this was the first time anyone had come close to proving it. We've got enough here to bring them down, the lead investigator assured Cal, flipping through the stack of incriminating files. But it'll take time. People with this much money don't go quietly. Cal nodded, his face grim. They'll fight back, but at least now the truth is out. Despite the arrests and the disruption of the operation, questions lingered. The villagers couldn't agree on what had brought the midnight beacon back to life. Was it the smugglers using the lighthouse as a signal, or something else entirely? And what of Henry Rowe, the vanished keeper? The recovered logbook painted a picture of a man spiraling into paranoia, but his ultimate fate remained a mystery. Maybe he knew too much, Maggie mused as she and Cal walked along the shoreline. Maybe Icebound silenced him before he could expose them. Or maybe the lighthouse kept it secret, Cal said. Some things don't want to be found. Healing the community, the villagers gathered for a meeting at the cafe, the usual hum of chatter replaced by a somber energy. The fate of Eldred Rock Lighthouse became the center of debate. We should leave it be, Jacob Tanner said, his voice steady but filled with conviction. The rock doesn't forgive. It's cursed, and anyone who goes back will pay the price. Marianne Blake, ever the pragmatist, shook her head. It's part of our history. Letting it crumble into the sea means losing part of who we are. We should preserve what's left. The villagers fell into heated discussion, some siding with Tanner's superstitions while others echoed Marianne's sentiments. For Maggie, the lighthouse was more than a relic, it was a story that needed to be told, even if it meant confronting uncomfortable truths. Henry Rote didn't deserve to be forgotten, Maggie said, her voice cutting through the room. The lighthouse was his life, and the least we can do is honor that. Later, as the villagers dispersed, Maggie found herself standing by the cliffs overlooking the ruins. She clutched the keeper's logbook tightly, its worn pages a reminder of the man who had watched over the beacon until it drove him to the edge. It's not just about the lighthouse, she said to Cal, who stood silently beside her. It's about the people connected to it, the lives it touched, for better or worse. Cal nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Sometimes, finding the truth is the only way to let go. The legend endures. Days later, the storm's aftermath was still visible in the battered cliffs and scattered debris along the shoreline. Cal returned to Eldred Rock one last time, standing on the jagged cliffs where the lighthouse had once stood. The air was crisp, the sea calm, but the weight of the place lingered. As he stared out over the water, a faint light flickered on the horizon. It wasn't the steady glow of a ship's beacon or the erratic flash of a lightning strike, it was something else entirely. Cal's chest tightened as he watched the light shimmer briefly before vanishing into the mist. "Did you see that?" Maggie asked, her voice soft as she joined him on the cliffs. "I saw it," Cal replied, his tone unreadable. "Do you think it's—" Maggie hesitated, searching for the right words. "A ghost? Or just some natural phenomenon?" Cal didn't answer immediately. Instead, he let the silence stretch between them, the sound of waves crashing below filling the void. Finally, he spoke. "Maybe it's both. Or neither. Sometimes the wilderness keeps its secrets for a reason." Maggie smiled faintly, her breath visible in the cold air. "Maybe that's what makes it so powerful, what we don't know." As they turned to leave, the faint light flickered again, just for a moment. Whether it was a trick of the mist, a reflection of something unseen, or the lingering spirit of the lighthouse, neither could say. But one thing was certain, the legend of Eldred Rock would endure, its story passed down through whispers and memories. As they walked back toward the village, Cal glanced at Maggie. "What's next for you?" She shrugged. "I think I'll write about this. People should know what happened here, not just the facts, but the truth." Cal nodded. "And what's the truth?" Maggie's smile widened. "That some places aren't just haunted by ghosts, they're haunted by the choices we make and the stories we leave behind. The lighthouse was gone, its secrets buried beneath the sea. But its light, both literal and symbolic, would live on in the hearts of those who dared to seek its truth." About the author, Brian Hamilton, an engineering geologist and adventure writer, shares his outdoor experiences on skyblueoverland.com. He has been in the engineering and construction field for over 35 years. He holds a bachelor's degree in geology from the University of Illinois and a master's degree in geological engineering from South Dakota Mines. With a geological engineering background, he provides unique insights into nature, adventure sports, and gear through engaging articles, trail guides, and creative storytelling. A certified professional geologist, Brian lives in Philadelphia. Author's note: this story is a work of fiction. All characters, events, and locations, while inspired by real-world elements, are products of the author's imagination. Eldred Rock Lighthouse and its surroundings serve as a creative backdrop, and any resemblance to actual events, persons, or organizations is purely coincidental. The narrative explores themes of mystery, greed, and survival within the framework of storytelling and does not reflect real historical accounts or present-day activities. What to read next? Jamie's Mysterious Lighthouse Adventure at Cape Hatteras. Art Meets Adventure, a review of the Pactal personal tale The Frozen North Mysteries, The Forgotten Mine Beneath a Broken Sky. Chapter 6, Into the Northern Wilds, Discovering the Charm of Dungeness Spit.